After two presentations of these individual speakers, we will have the question and answer session. So may I invite both speakers on the stage, please? Before the discussion, I would like to introduce the speaker of today's forum. The first speaker is Mr. Michael. So Dr. Michael Vitikiotics has worked as a writer and journalist in Southeast Asia for the past 35 years. After training as a journalist with the BBC in London, he moved to Southeast Asia and was a correspondent and then editor of the Far Eastern Economic Review. He has 2 books on the regional politics of Indonesia and Southeast Asia, written 2 novels set in Indonesia and 2 collections of short stories set in Southeast Asia. He is a frequent contributor to the opinion pages of regional and international publications. He is also a member of the Asia Society's International Council. Michael joined the HT Center in 2004, and as regional director, he is responsible for programs and activities across the region, including in Myanmar, Thailand, Indonesia, and Philippines. Michael holds a PhD degree from Oxford University in Southeast Asian History and Anthropology, and a bachelor degree from School of Oriental and African Studies. I would also like to introduce about second speaker, Ms. Renata. Renata nationality is Canadian and French, and she got her degree B Music from the University of Ottawa in 1982, and she also got Master of Arts Education from Columbia University and Master of Public Administration from Harvard University. Her professional experience, she worked as a UN resident coordinator and UNDP resident representative for Myanmar, China, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and also UN deputy resident representative in Myanmar and Mali. She was also a senior advisor for Bureau for Development Policy, UNDP New York, and also she was a technical advisor of ICPD Secretariat in New York. She was also a consultant from Harvard University, and she was also a program officer and then assistant resident representative in Vientiane, Laos. She was also a project officer from China Session, Association of Universities and Colleges of Canada from Ottawa, Canada. So after introducing the 2 speakers, may I firstly invite the first speaker, Mr. Michael, to commence your presentation, please. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Just wanting to check if you can all hear. Your Excellency, U Pien Mint, thank you very much for the invitation. Minister of Information, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to be here today before you all. I've been asked to speak about the global overview, setting the framework. I'm going to speak about my own experiences in Southeast Asia, and I'm going to speak in my personal capacity. Transition is a much-used word today, perhaps overused, and it's laden with subjectivity, implying changes in a certain direction towards democracy, social equality, justice for all, and economic development. Such transitions are normally measured in terms of progressive changes of governance, more open, inclusive, democratic, and effective in delivering welfare and prosperity for the many rather than the few. There are, of course, also transitions that go in the reverse direction. The challenge globally is to identify the policies that work in a transitional context, as the World Bank recently stated in its excellent 2017 World Development Report to produce life-improving outcomes. This becomes an even greater challenge in a world where growth and productivity are slowing at the same time that demands for welfare, justice, and good governance are rising everywhere. There is no single blueprint for successful transition. The world is too diverse, and even in our own region of Southeast Asia, the recipe for success in one context is not necessarily the same in another. Myanmar's context is among the most unique because of the long period of isolation from the developing economies of the ASEAN region, as well as the sizable landscape of internal strife and conflict that has afflicted the country for many decades. Recognizing this diversity, the World Bank has identified 3 core factors that are needed for a transition to succeed. I find them useful. They are commitment, coordination, and cooperation. I believe these indicators bear some examination in our regional context. For one of the biggest challenges facing transition in Southeast Asia has been the weakness of institutions and the resistance to change from entrenched vested interests who see democratic transition and equitable development as a threat to their status and livelihoods. What the 3 C's suggest are ways to overcome such obstacles. Greater commitment on the part of all stakeholders comes about when there is a solid consensus on the need to move from an unstable, insecure situation to one where security and growth prevail. This is more likely to result in policies that are implemented consistently without opposition. Coordination is important to ensure that capital expended in one area isn't wasted by the failure to embrace change in another. In many countries experiencing transition, bureaucratic inertia and the absence of a connected, coherent whole-of-government approach makes this challenging. Perhaps most importantly, cooperation is a critical path to the effectiveness of democratic transition. For without the cooperation of all levels of society and all stakeholders, there can be no equitable distribution of the fruits of transition. Unequal sharing of resources or the exploitation of pro-growth policies by a small elite is the surest path to the failure of transition, as this simply replicates the old system of governance, which in turn prolongs the period of transition or sends it into reverse. Why are these core factors so often missing? The lack of political will is one of the chief obstacles to effective transition. Typically, it isn't hard to identify and design the right policies, and there's no shortage of international advice and comparative experience. But it's much harder to overcome resistance to implementing these changes, because doing so would challenge the existing equilibrium and the prevailing balance of power. Thus, the global context suggests that successful transition depends on managing the distribution of power in society, which in turn determines the effectiveness of policy. To give just one regional example, Indonesia's democratic transition over 2 decades was undoubtedly assisted by the recognition early on of the need to decentralize administrative power. This and the remarkable enfranchisement of more than 180 million voters who were given the right to freely elect their president ensured that cooperation was very much an ingredient of Indonesia's transition. The other major factor often cited as a determinant of successful transition is, of course, the rule of law. Successful economies delivering goods and services in an equitable manner are generally governed by a predictable, robust set of laws. The rule of law helps strengthen the commitment and coordination of effective transition policies. The problem is that the laws are often written by the power holders before a broader base of society have the opportunity to influence their framing. In most transitional contexts, the changes that unfold are a threat to the status quo. They imply a redistribution of wealth and power and the greater sharing of resources. And there's a tendency, therefore, to build in safeguards to protect the old order. In neighboring Thailand, the latest constitution has been drafted under military rule and is laden with restrictions on political parties and the expression of popular sovereignty. That's because the conservative jurists drafting the new charter believe that political parties are the source of conflict in society. Thailand's democratic transition, therefore, faces obstacles because the rules are being set by those currently in power. It's important to allow for the organic evolution of law in a pluralistic setting in tandem with the process of transition. To turn again to this region, it's clear that the key obstacle to progressive change in Indonesia today, even after almost 2 decades of transition, is the weakness of the rule of law and the vulnerability of institutional checks and balances. There's a very good recent example, a scandal involving the diversion of funds from a planned revamp of national identity cards has embroiled the parliament, many of whose members are alleged to have siphoned money off from the scheme. As a result, some members of the Indonesian parliament are trying to undermine the National Corruption Commission investigating the scandal, and one commentator even wondered if the money spent on the last parliamentary election might have been better spent on building roads and schools. Without a judiciary that delivers fair and equitable justice and strong institutions to combat corruption, the social and political underpinnings of any transition will be weak and hostage to conflicts. The World Bank argues in its 2017 World Development Report that 3 specific drivers of change can help address these obstacles to transition. The first is the idea of elite bargains in which the distribution of power is changed by means of a process of negotiation and trade-off. The second is citizen engagement, which involves the more inclusive process of policy development. And the third, more controversially, is external intervention. On citizen engagement, there's a long and rich record of global experience involving the use of referendums, working groups, and commissions that engage people in grassroots consultations. One of the most successful of these exercises in this region accompanied the drafting of Thailand's constitution in 1997. It was a remarkable experience. In contrast with the latest charter, promulgated last year, the 1997 constitution was the product of a long process of consultation with people all over the kingdom. One of its hallmarks was the provision of independent bodies to check abuses of power. Negotiating with elites to manage the smooth redistribution of power is an altogether more challenging process, and one that is rarely achieved smoothly. One of the most workable trade-offs involves the cordoning off and protection of elite interests to prevent any violent backlash or sabotage of the transition. In economic terms, sadly, this sometimes means that elites are the first to benefit from transitional policies. External intervention in the Asian context of virulent sovereignty is the least preferable driver of change, and yet the Asian landscape of transition has too often lacked the kind of elite bargaining and citizen engagement that would help fend off external intervention. At the same time, it's argued by Asian experts that the norms and values forcibly imposed by external intervention are inappropriate or poorly adjusted to the local context. This was very much the feeling of Southeast Asia's tiger economies after the 1997 financial crash, when the IMF imposed strict conditions on the region to underwrite bailouts and recovery. The feeling was that the medicine was too strong, as the prescription to raise interest rates and cut subsidies almost killed the patient and resulted in severe distress and instability. Arguably, this was a case where, had there been a timely conclusion of elite bargains and engagement with citizens, a homegrown remedy could have been identified and applied. I would like to add one important ingredient of success in any transition, which is, of course, social stability. Here we see the dangerous nexus between poverty and social cohesion. In many countries where democratic transition has been seemingly successful, poverty and inequality threatens to sabotage the fruits of transition. Over a decade after a successful democratic transition in South Africa, more than 40% of the population still live in poverty, and this directly translates into social instability and high crime rates when you consider that almost 30% of black people are unemployed, compared with less than 10% of the white minority population. The Southeast Asian experience of transition has demonstrated that economic and political change puts considerable strain on the region's immense ethnic and religious diversity. The early years of Indonesia's democratic transition were marked by ethnic and religious violence and conflict on the margins of the republic. Whilst many observers saw this as a manifestation of resistance to change by the old order, recent years have seen the eruption of social conflicts that speak to a different causality. In Indonesia today, identity politics is on the rise. Following a global trend, growth in religious orthodoxy has hardened the boundaries between different religious communities and generated high degrees of intolerance and exclusivity that increasingly fuels violent conflict. These widening fissures in society have been exploited by political forces ambitious for power. What this means is that if the opening of political space to contestation is not accompanied by the provision of institutional and legal certainty for the rights and freedoms of all groups in society, there will inevitably be conflict. This puts a considerable pressure on governments to manage democratic transition responsibly, both to ensure there is tangible freedom and prosperity, but also to guarantee that constitutional rights are protected and equality is guaranteed. However, none of the prescriptions I've described will work unless there is a clear vision of what the nation broaching transition is striving towards. You can have competent, coordinated policies underpinned by the rule of law, but if people don't feel included, if they feel alienated and unequal, if they consider they have no future, then the transition will stumble and fail. Again, that's the challenge facing Indonesia today as its leadership struggles to reaffirm the principles of pluralism and equality that were fashioned by the country's founding fathers. Instead of asserting the vision of unity in diversity that lies at the core of Indonesia's national ideology, Indonesia's leaders are using harsh laws to ban organizations deemed a threat to unity, and many observers foresee a reversal of the country's democratic transition. Not all countries have historical foundations suited to successful transition in the modern era. Colonial legacies often exert a drag on the promotion of inclusive and equitable policies. Modern Malaysia has struggled to make the transition from a racially divided society based on the colonial practice of divide and rule to a modern integrated society where all groups have the same status and rights. Efforts to establish a modern vision of one Malaysia have been hampered by the entrenched economic and political interests that benefit from a racially divided society. History teaches us that a nation's welfare and freedom is based on effective equality supported by legal and institutional safeguards. So, and in conclusion, while governments are often preoccupied with ensuring that negotiation over the parameters of change is conducted as a homegrown process and avoiding external intervention, it's just as important that there is a coherent vision of the nation where all its people can enjoy the rights to freedom, welfare, and prosperity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Michael, for your very interesting presentation. So we will provide the question and answer session after the two individual presentations. So this time, I would like to invite Ms. Renata for your presentation, please.
No problem. Excellency, Dr. Phay Mien, Minister of Information, Excellencies from the Cabinet, representatives of the Government of Myanmar, Excellencies from the diplomatic community, from the international community, fellow UN staff members, and civil society, friends from the media. It's a really great and tremendous pleasure, actually, to be here to discuss this extremely important topic, not only for Myanmar, but for the world. I think that being the very first conference that covers such a broad scope of Myanmar's triple transition, it is wonderful to be able to start in this way, to look at, first of all, an overview, and then subsequently look at different aspects or different parts of the transition. I think in her opening address, Dawn San Suu Kyi mentioned that it's important to see the whole elephant and not just the trunk or the leg of the elephant. And so I think that this conference provides that opportunity to have a very good overview of all the dimensions, or many of the dimensions of the transition. I also hope that there will be future opportunities to discuss with democratic practitioners and also perhaps researchers on more in depth about some of the individual parts of the transitions in Myanmar, because I think that also would add a lot of value. Excellencies, friends, I'm going to speak to you today in my capacity as a development assistance practitioner, not so much in my formal capacity. I've had the opportunity to study good governance and democratization from the perspective of how the international community strives to understand the internal workings of these processes in different country contexts, and how to be most helpful in supporting those processes. I'm clearly not an academic, and I'm not a political scientist, and my comments will focus on a practitioner perspective. My comments will be a little bit impressionistic, and it will not be a formal academic presentation. As you all know, in the history of the world, there have been three main waves of democratization. The notion of these waves have been popularized by Samuel Huntington's book, The Third Wave, Democratization in the Late 20th Century, which dates back to the early 1990s. And since then, there have been many studies of these waves of democratization by political scientists, and theories have arisen, and some have managed to survive the test of time, and some have not. Some have come and some have waned. I think the waves of democratization, and particularly the tsunami wave of democratization in the latter part of the 20th century, stands out as a truly extraordinary phenomenon, because it reflected a true universal appeal for this notion of democracy. The rapid advance of democracy in the last 2 centuries, especially in the 20th century, really focused our attention on the quantity of democracy around the world and the criteria for successful transitions, usually measured by credible elections and transfer of power. But it also saw the notion or the concept of democracy grow into almost a mystique and a vision that was not always easy for everybody to explain why they were so attracted to it. This universal appeal for democracy, as I said, quite remarkable, and it's unprecedented in the history of political thought. It may be explained partially by the fact that the notion of democracy came to take on several meanings. Originally, when the Greek began experimenting and practicing democracy, at that time, the word they used only referred to the form of governance. But by the time we entered the 20th century, other political values had been attached to the concept of democracy. It was no longer just a form of governance by the people and for the people. It also began to convey fundamental political values, values of freedom, of liberty, of justice, and of equality. It's not surprising that people across the globe would aspire to these values, but it is extraordinary that a form of governance became so inextricably linked to political values, even when sometimes in practice the form of governance was not able to deliver on those values. Also, the notion of democracy during the 21st century merged with economic trends of the time, Particularly, I am referring to the expansion of global trade. The notion of democracy gradually merged with the phenomena of economic liberalism, and so the term liberal democracy emerged. Liberal democracy covers not only the form of government, but also freedoms of people, their liberty, their equality, but also freedoms of markets. All this got wrapped up into a single concept. While liberal economics did not always produce outcomes compatible with the political values that people associated with democracy, such as equality, justice, and freedom, the belief in those values and their connection to democratic systems was so strong that they often trumped even evidence to the contrary. So the people who yearned and fought, and in some cases even gave their lives for democracy, often ended up with systems of government that were more democratic, but also not entirely democratic. I think that all of us are familiar with adjectives that are used in some parts of the world regarding illiberal democracies and undemocratic democracies, corrupt democracies, fake democracies. So some people were left feeling that the fight for democracy had given them a kind of imperfect democracy. And this led to much research and lessons on the quality of democracy. So the focus shifted from the quantity of democracy around the world to the quality of democracy and indices to try to capture the quality of democracy. I'd like to talk a little bit now on a few global lessons. The study of democracy and democratic transition is endlessly fascinating and equally perplexing. Thousands of books and case studies have been written on the subject worldwide, and yet there's still so much that we don't know about it. There's no exact recipe for it. There are few robust predictors of successful transition. And while the focus of global research tends to be on transition to democratic rule, there are many cases of seemingly successful transition that are followed by reversion to autocratic rule. And we know little about this generically. With these caveats about the limit of global understanding of democratic transition, let me throw out a few observations that seem, from both in academic research but also from my limited understanding of some democratic experiences, that I think may have some relevance to Myanmar in her triple democratic transition. First, the application and adaptation of democracy in different countries covers a vast array of contexts and national experience, and so there are as many democratic models as there are countries who practice democratic rule. We know very well that a cookie-cutter blueprint approach to democratization does not work well, or not at all. You cannot impose models of democracy that work in one place and expect them to work in another, even though the idea behind them, the principles behind them, may be universal. You can create formal institutions of democracy relatively easily, but you cannot make them function quickly as they do in established democracies, because underneath the institutions are pre-existing traditional ecosystems of power and governance practice, and they don't disappear from one day to the next. Because the practice of democracy requires also a culture of democracy. It requires democratic competencies. And as Daw Aung San Suu Kyi mentioned, it requires, above all, democratic mindsets. For institutions to settle in and work well, they must grow roots in the society they serve. Equally important, however, is the process of adaptation and internalization. They must be protected from traditional and new power elite capture. Otherwise, countries risk getting stuck in an empty facade of democracy where the formal institutions exist but serve mainly as a camouflage for traditional power structures and undemocratic practice. Secondly, the transition to democracy occurs in different ways which may have some impact on the success of transition. Some studies show that those transitions that occur very rapidly, for example, through revolutions, may be more likely to fail than those that occur more gradually. Also, the level of economic development of a country when the transition occurs seems to matter. Lower income countries tend to succeed less well than higher income countries, although it's by no means a prediction. And lower income countries with rapid transitions tend to fare less well than lower income countries with more gradual transitions. Regarding the speed of transition, another phenomena has to be taken into account, and that is the attention factor. When power is changed through a rapid revolution, the nation and the international community is riveted and galvanized. After power has transferred, that same attention and that same focus on the need to establish the institutions and the culture of democracy often are not sustained. For a while, some theorists claimed that countries that had reached a certain level of economic growth before democratic transitions, they needed to reach a certain level before the transition could be successful. So therefore, many years ago, maybe 20 years ago or so, began advocating for sequencing and stressing the need for economic development and then democratic transition. And we've seen a number of countries that have decided to follow this path. But these notions have been revised since then because there are many examples of successful democratic transition of lower income countries. And a level of economic growth makes democratic transition easier, but it is by no way, as I said previously, a predictor. There is also a growing sense, from a philosophical point of view, from people, for example, like Dr. Amartya Sen, who advocate that countries do not become fit for democracy, they become fit through it. In other words, it's the process of democratization that renders a country democratic, as opposed to any kind of preparation before it. There is a magic number out there, however, which is $6,000 per capita income, where statistically, when one looks at all democratic countries around the world, there is an observation that countries who are democratic and who have reached a per capita income of $6,000 do not revert to autocratic rule. The third observation I wanted to share with you relates to economic growth and stability and economic management. This relates to a large extent to delivering on people's expectation. When most people think about democracy, most average citizens, they think both about freedoms and equalities and about economic outcomes. In fact, they may think that democratic freedoms will result in socioeconomic improvements, that the democratic dividend equals improved living conditions. This is obviously not automatic, but it is the basis of most people's expectations. So finding ways to limit economic volatility during transition and for immediately responding to people's aspirations and expectations for socioeconomic progress are very important. Countries like, for example, Poland and others that went through very rapid and serious economic transition imposed great hardships, economic hardships on their people, but seem to have managed to succeed in the transition, at least partially because of the extensive social safety nets that they extended to their people. Countries in transition that experience high inflation, particularly of staple items and other vulnerability, seem to have a much rougher time with transition, with lower rates of success. So the management of the economy, its organization, the efficient allocation of resources matter for a successful transition. Fourthly, and related to the first point, people's understanding of democratic processes and their ability to participate meaningfully in it matter. This is both because one measure of success of a democratic transition is people's satisfaction with it, and the greater their understanding and involvement in the process, the more likely they will be to interpret what's going on, to understand the transition takes time, and to buy into the process in the long term. People's understanding and ability to participate also matter because democracy requires citizen engagement to keep it on track. It requires that people have meaningful avenues to contribute towards democratic agenda setting, that they have access to information needed to be able to understand and engage on the issues, and that they feel able to influence the outcomes, at least partially. Fifthly, studies show that rule of law reform and efforts to try to level the playing field, expanding access to justice and creating fairer justice outcomes, breaking the elite stranglehold on wealth and opportunities, all this matters a great deal. People long for democracy partly to escape arbitrary and often brutal coercion. And they long for it often because they think it will deliver a system of governance that accords them respect and consideration. So democratic transitions that are able to deliver on this more quickly are more likely to succeed and consolidate. Sixthly, the equality part of the political values associated with the term democracy matter a great deal. More equal societies tend to progress smoother and mature quicker on their democratic journey than societies fraught with wide disparities in income and wealth. So policies and programs designed to share the wealth of a nation seem to help the democratic process. Seventh, there are endless studies of the institutions of democracy, on the dimensions and types of democracy: representational democracy, deliberative democracy, associational democracy, procedural democracy, etc. But there is very little in the literature written about democratic leadership, apart from the process of electing a leader. But democratic elections do not always produce leaders who hold democratic values and principles. In fact, many countries democratically elect leaders whose values and behaviors are far removed from the democratic values and hopes and aspirations that the people aspire towards. This is not only true for young democracies, but also long-established democracies. We see a rise in populist leaders in several established democracies around the world that is a cause of great concern. Eighth, every positive dimension of democracy has potentially a negative side. Take, for example, political parties. Political parties are absolutely essential for organizing policies, for collecting the multiple and diverse points of view of society into packages that can be worked on from a governance perspective. Parties are absolutely essential for a well-functioning democracy, but when they lose the trust of the people, when they cease to serve as true representatives of the people or have difficulties aggregating the multiple diverse views of their constituencies, when they get involved in corruption, when they misuse their power, they can be very detrimental to the democratic process. Similarly, there are many other aspects. Each aspect of democracy that is absolutely vital can have negative impact on the quality of democracy. There are many more lessons that can be learned from international experience, but I will leave you with just a few final takeaways from my own personal observation. Democracy is absolutely the least worst form of government, as I think Churchill mentioned many years ago. But it also can be very messy. And we need to be patient with the messiness. Some of that messiness is maybe actually needed. It's not linear. Democracy is not black and white. Countries that embark on a democratic journey have to get used to navigating in a gray zone. And the people have to get used to that as well. Democracy takes time. In fact, the transition is never over. Democracy is a never-ending journey. It's not as if you democratize and then it's finished. It's constantly evolving, even in the oldest democracies on the planet. We need to be patient with it, but we also need to be highly vigilant. And finding this balance between vigilance and patience is really about the art of democratic governance. Democracy is not a panacea. It shouldn't be seen as a religion. It must be examined critically in order to keep it working well. It must be studied dispassionately, and we must not hesitate to constantly try to improve it in practice. A lot of the indicators of probable success of democracies, particularly new democracies, are economic. And therefore, as I said before, the management of the economy matters enormously, as does economic stability and growth and income distribution. This is all part of the bigger social contract. And leadership matters. Finally, let me just conclude by recapping that never has the world seen so many countries classified today as democratic. But also globally today, there's a serious loss of confidence in many democracies. You can see this in leadership polls where people's assessment and confidence in their leaders is abysmally low in many countries. You can see this in terms of parliamentary outcomes, where instead of bringing together divergent views and sorting out consensual agreements that allow the nation to move forward, they end up blocked. You see this in the neglect of minority interests, particularly in countries whose system privilege a majority rule from electoral outcomes. You see this through party politic behavior and the declining confidence of people in political parties around the world. You see this in representational deficits overall in the system. You see it through elite capture, through lobby groups and others, through corrupt processes, and through the emergence of populism and identity politics. In some countries, they even refer to their democracy as a 5-minute democracy. 5 minutes, the time it takes to cast a vote. That is not the kind of democracy that most people want, and that's certainly not the kind of democracy Myanmar wants. Myanmar's transition, its triple transition, is happening in this rather confused global environment. It's happening where there's massive changes externally, which are unsettling, and it's happening at a nascent phase when many other countries have had much more time to consolidate their democracies. This 21st century characteristic of the environment in which Myanmar is transitioning impacts greatly on Myanmar's ability to navigate its transition. It is very much under the media spotlight, whereas other countries during their democratic transition may not have been subject to the same scrutiny. And it is also happening at a time where there is increasing discontent with the quality of democracy around the world. And so there is a lot of public outcry and public demand for a higher quality. And this environment, external environment of demanding higher and highest quality also has an impact on Myanmar's transition. I haven't said anything about military to civilian transition or about the peace process, and that's simply because time is short and because there are other sessions that are in the program for that. I think my time is up now. I just wanted to conclude by saying that there are many lessons out there in the international sphere, but there is a great deal that we do not know about it, democratic transition. There are theories, and some of those theories have proven more accurate than others, but we need to be humble also in distilling clear lessons learned. But there's even more that we don't know about Myanmar's transition. And that is why this conference, I think, is so vitally important. It's extremely important to be able to discuss, to exchange views in a dispassionate and in a constructive manner to better understand some of the challenges, to better understand some of the opportunities, to take away a little bit of the ideology and the mythology of Myanmar's transition and look a little bit more at the reality and the truths of it. Myanmar's transition is very complex, and there's no question it will take time. As I said before, we need patience, but we also need a clear strategic vision and eternal vigilance. A very famous American founding father mentioned that freedom's cost is eternal vigilance. Eternal vigilance is the cost of freedom. Getting the balance right between patience and vigilance and strategy is the art of successful transition, and Myanmar is crafting that art now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Renata, for your very comprehensive presentation. So, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, now we have the question and answer session. So, for those who would like to discuss more about the subject are invited to raise question. အခုကျမတို့အမေးဖြေကဏ္ဍဖြစ်ပါတယ်ရှင်။တို့ပါ၍မိခွန်းများမေးဖို့ဖိတ်ခေါ်အပ်ပါတယ်။အခုဆွေးနွေးသွားတဲ့အကြောင်းအရာများနဲ့ပတ်သက်ပြီးတော့မိခွန်းများမေးလို့ပါကလက်ထောင်လိုက်ပါကျမတို့မိုက်ခရိုဖုန်းလာပေးပါမယ်။မေးခွန်းမမေးခင်မှာကျမတို့နာမည်ရဲ့ယာရုရဲ့အဖွဲ့အစည်းရဲ့လေးတစ်ချက်မိတ်ဆက်ပေးပါရှင်။ရှေ့မှာဟိုမှာမိုက်ရှိပါတယ်ရှင်။ဟုတ်ကဲ့ကျမမေးပေးပါရှင်။
Thank you. I'm Dr. Min Zan. I taught previously until recently at Multimedia University in the law as a law professor. I think I have one question each for each of the speakers. For Dr. Michael, we have met in the restroom at Kuala Lumpur, and Unyini Tham, then the regime official, blasted you and fired an economic review for being so biased against Myanmar government. If you recall. My question to you is, you mentioned about Indonesia. I have only one brief question. The fall of General Suharto on May 1998 can arguably be the start of the Indonesian transition. So 1.5 years, by September 1999, the Indonesian situation is like now in August 2017. How would you, from your observation, compare the Indonesian transition 1.5 years, less than 1.5 years after Suharto's fall, and 1 year and 5 months after the people's government took power in Burma, Myanmar? That is my question to Dr. Michael. To Ms. Renata, brief question. You mentioned about illiberal democracy, representative democracy, liberal democracy, transitional democracy. I would like to ask, again, I suppose this is Chatham House rule, what is your personal view? Again, I know you don't represent necessarily the UNDP, but what is your personal view of the current democracy form of democracy in Myanmar? Is it illiberal democracy? Is it transitional democracy? A colleague of mine sitting here 7 feet away from me told in a Burmese language symposium 3 months ago that it is not yet transitional democracy, it is still illiberal democracy. So what is your view, ma'am? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I'm under strict instructions from my good friend and General Agus Wijoyo not to steal his thunder on Indonesia, and I don't intend to. And he would be the best person, actually, as one of the leading military reformers of that period, to answer that question from an overall point of view. I can give you, though, and it is an extremely good question because it reminds me of my own experience as a journalist covering that transition in 1998 and 1999, because in fact some of the worst street violence involving students actually came after the fall of President Suharto and under the first few months of the presidency of President B.J. Habibie, who was in fact one of the, I think will be seen in history as one of the leading reformist presidents. But in the first few months he did struggle because there was a sense of disappointment, especially among the students who had belatedly protested so strongly against the old order. And there were several demonstrations where in fact the army did fire on students after the transition had taken place, which was tragic. But it did reflect the deep sense of disappointment that many people had, that things were not moving fast enough. And the point I will make is that, of course, in any transition, as I made in my speech, there are accommodations that need to be made. You can't simply sweep away the old order and bring in something new. It's not a sudden break. And in fact, most of the political players and actors who participated in that transition in 1998, they remained in political positions, even though they had been servants, if you like, of the old order. They had been ministers and officials under President Suharto. They remained in position. Many of them simply adapted to new roles, embraced democracy. They had probably always wanted to embrace democracy. And so what we mean here is a transition. It's not a sudden break. But for many people, there was disappointment. And there was, if my memory serves me correctly, because I was there at the time, there were many tragic incidents that took place under the more democratic government. It took many, many years for that transition to actually settle down, and it did take changes to the constitution, changes to the institutions to accommodate the new democratic transition. The vision had always been there. People were certain of the direction they wanted to take. As I often said at the time, Indonesia has been a democracy since 1945. There was just a long period of slumber for 30 years.
So I will respond to your question on what kind of democracy is Myanmar's, and is this a democratic transition or not? I think clearly it's a democracy in the making, and perhaps the best way to describe it is a nascent democracy. All of us know that the journey has begun, and so, and I think we have to be careful, because the 2015 elections and the smooth transfer of power to the new government is not something that can be ignored. It is something that is quite historical. And to basically try to classify it as an illiberal democracy, or how should I say, or describe it in negative terms, I think it's more constructive and more helpful to think of it as a work in progress. Myanmar's democratic journey has definitely begun. It's definitely taken some first and extremely important steps, but it's far from complete. Everyone knows that. The journey ahead is long, the journey ahead is difficult. There's a situation of power sharing in the country, which is awkward, and which needs to be managed carefully so that the deeper democratization process can be successful in the end. This is the kind of, I think, discussion that would be extremely helpful, and for which I'm terribly grateful that we're having this conference. I hope that in some of the smaller sessions we can talk more about these kinds of things. I think it's important to speak about them dispassionately, to speak about them constructively. I hesitate to throw labels around, because I think that sometimes they're not actually terribly helpful. But to answer your question, perhaps the most succinct answer is that this is a nascent democracy at the beginning of its democratic journey, with some significant, I think, processes that it has accomplished.
Hello. My name is Zong, social researcher and a regular contributor to Myanmar Affairs Journals, published by Center of Myanmar Affairs Studies. My questions goes to Mr. Michael. I learned from your presentation that weak institutions are biggest challenges to democratic transition. So in our experience, we have a lot of practical experience on how weak institutions look like in the context of Myanmar. But I would like to know, how do you define strong institutions to make Myanmar transition successful, and particularly related to the current peace process? Because HD, in my understanding, is giving technical assistance to Myanmar peace process. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the things that I've observed about Myanmar's transition, and one of the fortunate things that you have done from the beginning, is you have developed a well-developed parliament, which is, I think, a very important basic institution of any democratic transition. And the parliament in this government and the government before was used very forcefully to pass laws, to deliberate and pass laws, which is in itself, I think, a sign of institutional strength, which is often lacking in some of the countries in this region. Very often, democratic transitions are defined by the integrity of elections. But in fact, a good election does not a democratic government make, as I think you were saying, Renata. So I think that it's important to note that one of the fortunate things for Myanmar is that your parliament is respected and developed and is becoming a strong institution, which is very important. The other important thing, of course, is to make sure that, as again, we've seen in other countries in this region, if the political parties are weak and don't have well-developed programs, then unfortunately, lowest common denominator politics will take hold. And that's where you see the social divisions and conflicts take place. So I think it's also the next thing to watch for here is really the strength and integrity of political parties. On the peace process, I had not wanted to say very much in my speech because I think it's important to address the broader issues of democratic transition. But of course, the peace process is, as we heard from the State Councillor, Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, one of the priorities, the priority of this government. And she was saying that without peace, perhaps there can be no development. I'm beginning to be a bit concerned, though, not so much about the peace process itself, but about the underlying economic drivers that fuel the conflicts that are so difficult to resolve. And my question would be to those involved in the peace process, to what extent are the difficulties and intransigencies of the parties due not so much to their political demands, but to their economic considerations? Because in many of these areas, the depth and extent of the illicit economy makes it far too profitable, perhaps, to make peace. And so that's one of my biggest concerns. I think the process seems to be well designed. There's a great deal of commitment to it. But I worry about the underlying drivers, whether they're being addressed. And in that sense, it is important to have, in parallel, an economic development strategy that addresses the weaknesses of the economy in those areas, so that the leaders of those groups can actually be drawn to the table more effectively. Thank you.
I'm Aung Latun, Vice Chairman of Myanmar Press Council. I used to work for Reuters for 23 years and for the government for 10 years or 11 years. So I've got a question, my fellow journalist, Mr. Vatikiosti. Thank you so much for your enlightening paper, especially for stressing the importance of a homegrown process and for highlighting the dangers of external intervention. Would you be kind enough to assess the ongoing transition process in our country? And what do you think of the international media, some international media's agenda setting and sensationalizing in reporting some sensitive issues in our country? Thank you, sir.
The international media in regard to Myanmar, but not just Myanmar, but the whole of Southeast Asia, is not the same as it once was. There are very limited resources for international media, which means that very often a story will only be covered if it is sensational, because people are not here covering on a day-to-day basis in the international media as much as they were before, which is a great pity, because it means, of course, that you will only catch the attention of the international media when there is something sensational. And therefore there's not often a fuller or deeper understanding of the complex dynamics. That's a shame. That's a matter of resources. That's the state of the world's media today. That's why it's terribly important to have not just a homegrown process, but a homegrown media that is covering and has the ability to understand the complexities of the story here and report it and influence international opinion. I think that would be my answer to that. But on the issue of external intervention, I think, we were all, those of us who, as I mentioned in my speech, were working in this region during the Asian financial crisis, where there was a sudden and very disruptive intervention from the outside world, from the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, coming in and demanding that governments do things in a certain way. It was a very scarring experience. And they didn't always get the formula right, as I said. But I think it's also fair to say that the crisis, no one saw it coming. It was not properly understood. And therefore, to some extent, you can't blame governments for not necessarily coming up with the right prescriptions, because it was a very much a product of the way that money markets worked at a time when people could vote, if you like, with their bank accounts on whether the integrity of the economy of a country was good or not. This was for me a very, very important lesson in how external intervention works. I think when it comes to politics and sovereignty, it's very much more, we see the international community working in a very much more tentative, cautious, sensitive way. I think in the case of Myanmar, the international community generally has been very, very sensitive towards the concerns of the country, not wanting to intervene even on the question of technical advice and support. It's very, very tentative, and I think everyone is deeply respectful of the boundaries here. I will say one thing, though, on China, because I think China has, what we see from a Southeast Asian perspective from the other countries, is that China has paid the closest attention to the transition here than to anything else that they're doing in Southeast Asia, because of course the country borders on China and there are security concerns. And what I see is that China's struggling internally with how it can manage to retain the principled stand of non-interference, with involvement in the peace process, with its concern for what happens inside the country. And I think it's going to be very, very interesting going forward to see how China's officials, its diplomats, manage that very, very delicate process. On the one hand, respecting the principles of non-interference, but on the other hand, also offering support and help, often in quite an intrusive way.
My name is Nobandin Zamyo. I'm the Kenya Ethnic Affairs Minister from Yangon region. I want to ask one question. This morning, State Councillor already mentioned that peace and development needed it concurrently. We have to do, and also I'm totally agreed with you mentioned in this morning for the we need the successful transition. We have to do the commitment, coordination, and cooperation. This one, I'm totally agree that. So my question is, if we go into the peace and development process in Myanmar, what kind of institution or ministry, among 21 members or ministry, which ministry and what kind of institution is the most important role model to play in peace and development process during the Myanmar democratic transition process? This is my one question. Another one question is, do you think, because I'm the representative of Ministry of Ethnic Affairs as well, so I would like to ask the Myanmar democratic transmission process, Ministry of Ethnic Affairs also how should involve in the role model during the peace and development process? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very interesting question. Peace and development and peace. I think that with regards to pursuing them in an integrated manner, which is, I think, what the State Councillor was referring to, that one doesn't come first, each have to support each other in a symbiotic relationship that mutually reinforce each other, and they have to be pursued in the same breath, so to speak. And if I could just also mention that this is exactly what I think the UN Secretary General is trying to do with regards to his reforms, because the United Nations has separate institutions for peace and security, for development, for human rights, for humanitarian services, and he has recognized that in the provision of those services to countries in need, that even with the best intentions, there can be difficulties created if there's not adequate, not just coordination, but integration, because the reality on the ground is integrated. I mean, when communities are suffering and there's a need for a response, they often don't make any differentiation between the kind of assistance that's needed. They don't put it into categories. They just have a natural response and needs. So this emphasis on integrated thinking and integrated approaches to resolving complex problems, I think is very much needed. And I think it's absolutely timely that we all begin to reflect more deeply on this, because we understand it conceptually, but what does it actually mean in practice? I think to begin with, it means when we analyze the problem, we need to do it without any one particular lens. We need to analyze the problems in a natural way, in a way where the problems speak for themselves rather than our lenses through which we see the world apply upon them. So I would say that in the analytical phase, we need to be integrated, and we need to think seamlessly across these various areas of specialization that have grown up. With regards to which institutions are most important, I don't think I'm well placed to answer that question, because I feel that tremendous effort has gone into creating the formal institutions of the peace process, and they are the second generation of institutions after the previous government, and these institutions need time to mature. And so therefore, to come in and suggest that there should be different institutions, I don't think is appropriate. I think that the institutions which are core to the peace process, which are joint institutions involving the government, the ethnic groups, the Tanbada, these must be given time to develop, to mature, and to deliver. We know, for example, that the JMC, which is one of the important arms, official arms of the peace process at the highest level, there is, in a very short period of time, there has been progress made. Progress, I would say, not only in terms of the objectives that they have to accomplish, but also in the working relationship and the levels of confidence between the different parties who are jointly trying to pursue these common goals. And the same in other aspects of the other institutions of the peace process. So I would say virtually all institutions in the government of Myanmar are important for the peace process. If not central to the architecture of it, they are important because each of them will have to internalize how the peace process influences the services of that institution. If you take the Ministry of Health, for example, or the Ministry of Education, of course, they're responsible for the provision of education across the country, but in the ethnic armed controlled areas, there are some where they've already developed their own education system. And therefore, a dialogue has to be, once the NCA is signed and the ceasefire is respected, there needs to be preparation that requires dialogue from the central ministries with the leaders and the communities involved in these ethnic controlled areas. So almost all institutions will be important for the peace process, and each will have its own, each will have its own purpose and its own kinds of activities that it would be involved with, and each will need to internalize a conflict sensitivity approach towards its services. Thank you.
Minglawa, I'm John Mason, Minister of Natural Resources, Forests and Environment Conservation of Go Region. And here I would like to focus on the constitutional reform process. It is also related with the democratic transition. Now our country is going on the peace process at the same time as state building. And also, Ms. Ritana, you mentioned that there is also mercy. In some extent, mercy is also necessary, and also we need to be patient. So we are patient with mercy, and we are also facing with the many mercy in the country. So what I would like to, ask you is that the constitutional reform process. So how we should be going on, because it is very challenging. We are going now on the decentralization process. So from the bottom-up process, at the same time, they're creating the democratic culture among the people. So at the same time, we should have the strategy. We should have the strategy on the constitutional reform process. And also, that's why I would like to ask you, your experience on sharing this kind of the democratic transition and constitutional reform process. Thank you very much.
Thank you for giving me the very hardest question. I think it's very difficult for me to answer that because issues of constitutional reform depend on so many factors and on, obviously, the leaders of the country. And I think everyone would agree that Myanmar's current constitution prevents a full transfer or a full transition to democracy. It doesn't mean that there are many elements of democracy that cannot be grown under the current constitution. You mentioned the performance of parliament, not only at the union level, but also at the regional and state level, which is, I think, moving ahead very in a very encouraging way. So that is not to say that there are not very fundamental elements of democracy that cannot be grown and nurtured and cultured now, and which are already being grown and nurtured and cultured and cultivated now. With regards to any kind of constitutional reform in any country, there has to be, particularly in an environment which the State Councillor has very explicitly mentioned, reconciliation and peace is her first priority, the first priority of the NLD government. So with that first priority, the constitutional reform process will be influenced by that. And it means that there has to be an agreement and an understanding on how to approach it, not only between the leaders of the country, but also the people of the country. So you'll have to excuse me because I will not be able to say much more about that. Again, I think everyone understands that the current constitution of the country is a transitional constitution, and that the final end would be a full transfer from military to civilian rule in the country. And the question, therefore, that is more important is, as you said, how should that happen? And that is a question truly for the leaders of the country and the people of the country.
I just want to add a point on the Constitution and a comparative perspective. You know, the Constitution of Cambodia has a preamble which basically says this is a country that has risen from the ashes of conflict. And so the preamble to the Constitution is all about recovering from conflict. And I recently took a group of Indonesian members of parliament to Cambodia to meet with the National Assembly, and my Indonesian friends said to their Cambodian counterparts, we may have a better practice of democracy under our transition, but you Cambodians have really learnt what it means to reconcile. And so reconciliation is valued as an important part of any transition. And I think Cambodia has gone a long way towards that, both in terms of process and in terms of the attitude of the people who've recovered from this terrible war that only ended in 1979. And so I think it's important to raise the factor of reconciliation as an important aspect of transition.
Hi, Tamang Tan from the Center for Economic and Social Development. My question goes to the Michael, and it's another way of the framing the minister's questions about the constitutional amendment in Myanmar. The current policy is set a linkages between the peace process and constitutional amendment. My question is this the only policy that Myanmar can follow, coupling with the peace process and the democratic transition? Or it didn't appear that the process is going on like that, so that in that sense, as you remarked on your previous comment, that conflict, the nature of conflict is a long term, and it takes a lot of time. So if we are going to follow this transitional policies, that means that our democratic transition will take time too. So is it a wise, or what is the alternative way that we can follow? Thank you.
So if I understand the question correctly, you're asking about sequencing and doing things together. Is that right? And you're asking, is it always necessary to do things together, or should there be a sequence? I mean, I think in very complex matters, like huge social and political change, like Myanmar is experiencing, you will have a number of different circumstances where some things may need to be sequenced and some things will be happening simultaneously, even within the same area. So perhaps the bigger story might be together. In other words, development and peace, or peace and constitutional reform. It may be a package, but within that package, at the detailed level, there may be sequencing. I think that the things that are, or the transitions that Myanmar is experiencing now are so profound and so complex and so difficult that it's really impossible to come up with a recipe. And I think that the Myanmar people and those who are friends of Myanmar and who want to see Myanmar succeed have to allow for a little bit of unpredictability as well, because the government and the ethnic armed groups and the Tatmadas, the parties to the peace process, may not know exactly how things will turn out. They may need to make adjustments along the way. And peace processes take time. We're, of course, all impatient to see Myanmar prosper and benefit from the dividends of peace and move towards full democratization. But I think that in order for things to grow roots and for these kinds of transitions to be able to internalize into the fabric of society and the nation, many of them will take time, and we are not necessarily in the best place to anticipate how long they will take and when breakthroughs will happen and whether adjustments will be needed along the way. So I think we have to have a little bit an open mind towards the issue of sequencing and togetherness. And I know that's maybe not a very satisfactory answer to your question because it was a very precise question, but I don't think we can say it categorically that this has to be sequenced and this has to go together. There isn't a desire to do it in a more integrated, all-at-once fashion because there's a recognition that things are all integrated in one way or another and there's a cause and effect between different elements. But there may also need to be some sub-aspects of that need to be sequenced.
So because of the time constraint, this is the last question for this session.
My name is Min Tin, political analyst and writer from contributor to Myanmar Affairs Studies Center. I would like to ask Ms. Renata Nicola, how do political regime type of, according to your speech previously, what is the democratic transitional period? What we learned about, that is, previously, so many questions. And then we would like to ask this. How Myanmar transitional period or Myanmar transitional processes will be happened. And number 2, Mr. Mike Ficurius, AG Center, thank you very much for your kindness to peace process. We are very diverse in the other countries. How do we mention it? Thank you.
Last one first. Okay, so I'll start with your last question. Thank you very much. Managing diversity. I think there are 2 challenges facing Southeast Asia in managing diversity, not just Myanmar, because the diversity of this region in all the countries is immense. It's one of the most diverse regions of the world. And all the different countries have similar challenges in managing diversity, whether it's the Muslim majority country of, say, Indonesia, the Buddhist majority country of, say, Myanmar. I think the challenges where you have a majority and a minority are always, and the series, Myanmar has so many minorities, 135 acknowledged nationalities. I would answer the question this way. I think it was much easier, outwardly speaking, under periods of, say, authoritarian rule, where the management of diversity was done through the rigid imposition of authority. And as we move into the democratic transition period, there will inevitably be stresses and strains that emerge because with the freedom of expression, people start to assert their identity and demand greater space and rights, autonomy. So all these things have happened in Southeast Asia in the last 30 years because of that gradual move towards more openness. And therefore, as I said in my speech, it's a management challenge. How do you manage the balance between providing that space so that people feel that their democratic aspirations can be expressed with the responsibility of social order and stability? I don't think there are any easy prescriptions. And in the case of Myanmar, it's the one country where you have this geographical manifestation of diversity. A bit, for me, like the case of India, which is similarly described as a union, where the states are determined and defined by ethnic and religious diversity. It's the same here in Myanmar. You have whole geographical areas. Of course, demography is beginning to change that. The movement of people at the end of the day, I think, will make great changes here in Myanmar in terms of ethnic diversity. But you will still have that management challenge. And I think it's never easy for any government, because the government will always be blamed for not either providing enough space or not providing enough control. And I just think it takes extraordinary leadership to be able to manage both those things, and to provide the space and also to exercise a sense of responsibility. But as I said at the end of my speech, I think it's also important to have that vision. What is the vision of the country at the end of the day? Is it one where there is equality of everyone, regardless of what their ethnic background is and religion? Or is it one where there is still a differentiation? And, you know, I look at the experience that I've had in a country like Thailand, for instance, where they overcome that problem by essentially creating a sort of supra form of identity, which is loyalty to the monarch, which means that you can subsume the question of who is more equal than others under a sort of another form of identity. But not everyone is in a position to do that. And Indonesia has one of the, in this part of the world, in fact in the whole of East Asia, I think it has one of the most modern forms of defining identity, which is this unity in diversity concept, which came about, 70 years ago, but required the majority people, the Javanese, to actually subsume their own importance and give space to the minorities as on an equal basis. And this was a visionary thing to do, and it was one that has lasted the entire 70 years of independence and has stood the test of time, but is now under pressure. It's under pressure because there is the reassertion of a majority that wants to ensure that it maintains preeminence. And that has put this whole issue of unity and diversity under pressure. And so once again, I would just say there is this challenge of balancing the management of diversity and freedom of expression. And it's always very difficult for governments in this region. And it's become more difficult of late because, as I said, of the assertion of identity politics. Thank you.
As I know time is running away from us, let me just perhaps also try to answer your question and also conclude by just reiterating, I think, the need for all of us to better understand the Myanmar transition. Sometimes there may seem to be things that are unclear, or at least we are confused about because we just don't understand it. Perhaps there may be other reasons for that. Should this element of the reform move faster or slower? Should this element be sequenced, or should it be done simultaneously? Is this a moment where we should be more patient, or is this a moment where we need to see accelerated reform? Are efforts that are being made actually producing the results, the desired results? Is it realistic to expect to feel or to reap the results now, or is it only realistic to expect them to be felt later? Are things moving forward? Are things moving sideways? All these things are quite difficult for many people to understand, particularly people on the outside. So I would just like to make a plea for many more kinds of dialogues like this, many more kinds of conferences, opportunities to be able to discuss, as I said, dispassionately, constructively. I think the greater the understanding we can have of some of the complexities involved. We all know it's a complex process, but we might not all be aware specifically of many of the complexities. And the art of democratization is really a successful management of all these numerous changes, of the tensions involved with these changes, and with the different views that people have of what needs to be done, how it's being done. And managing that process is extraordinarily difficult. And I think the fact that Myanmar has got to where it has in such a short time is truly remarkable. So I would like to just conclude by recognizing the many efforts that have been made and the many successes that have been achieved by different parts, by different actors in this reform process, and look forward to many more discussions like this so all of us can better understand. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Mr. Michael Vitikio Tix, and also Ms. Renata Nicolak Dasalian for sharing your valuable knowledge and experience to us today. Thank you very much. So please give a round of applause for these two experts. So thank you very much.